The prevailing narrative focuses on launch signatures and hypersonic missile trajectories. This is a deliberate misdirection. The kinetic cost of such an exchange is a known quantity, a deterrent in itself. The true, primary vector of attack against a modern superpower is not a projectile, it is silence. CSIS reports confirm that over 97% of global data, including trillions in financial transactions, travels through a handful of undersea fiber optic cables. These are the systemic liabilities. A targeted severance is not a traditional act of war. It is an act of economic paralysis, triggering a global solvency crisis in minutes. Simultaneously, a satellite blinding campaign renders the state's eyes useless. The result is the blind Leviathan, a superpower possessing immense kinetic power, but severed from its own intelligence and command infrastructure. It cannot verify the attack's origin, cannot measure the damage, and therefore cannot execute a proportional response. In this state of informational blackout, the system's final protocol is activated. Unable to de-escalate, its only remaining option to prevent total strategic collapse is a launch-on-warning escalation to the highest possible kinetic level. The silence becomes the trigger. The motive for asymmetric warfare is not strength. It is a systemic solvency crisis. When a state faces domestic collapse, politically and economically, it cannot afford the kinetic cost of a protracted, conventional war. The campaign itself becomes a balance sheet liability. Consider the trigger for the current European conflict. Analysis from CSS frames the operation not as a war of choice, but as a strategic response to a mounting domestic solvency crisis within Russia. An unpopular war is a political liability that a fragile state cannot sustain. When a state's conventional options become fiscally and politically impossible, it is forced to pivot. The battlefield shifts from direct kinetic engagement to asymmetric vectors where it retains leverage, energy infrastructure, financial markets, information systems. This isn't a mistake. It's the protocol for a compromised power. This forced pivot to asymmetry is the accelerant for global risk. A rival sees this internal fragility and understands the response options are limited. Because a proportional kinetic response is off the table, the failing state's only remaining protocol to avoid collapse is a launch-on-warning escalation to the highest level. Weakness does not invite negotiation. It invites catastrophe. The core of this new warfare is not ideology, it is arbitrage. According to analysts at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, the kinetic cost to neutralize a $5 million main battle tank is now approximately $500. This is not a rounding error. It is a systemic kill switch for legacy military doctrine. For every multi-million-dollar asset a superpower fields, a rival can deploy 10,000 threats. The math dictates the strategy. The defender faces a solvency crisis. Losing one tank is a major capital liability. For the attacker, losing one drone is a negligible operational expense. This is the blueprint for attritional warfare against a high-cost, low-inventory military. This economic inversion is what strategists call the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal, state-level force has collapsed. The ability to destroy a nation's most advanced hardware is no longer monopolized by superpowers. It is now commercially available, off the shelf, creating a permanent, asymmetric liability against any technologically dependent force. The primary battlefield is no longer geographic, it is systemic. Adversaries operate within the gray zone, the strategic space between declared peace and total war. The objective is not territory. The objective is to trigger a solvency crisis in the target superpower by exploiting its internal fragility. Analysts at RUSI confirm this battle space is defined by plausible deniability. Asymmetric attacks, cyber, economic, political, are launched from these zones to test a superpower's response protocols. They are low-cost probes designed to measure reaction times and political will, mapping out the precise vectors of internal decay. The Stimson Center's Top 10 Global Risks is not a prediction, it's a menu of available leverage points. Beijing's repeated warnings of war over Taiwan are a public calibration of this strategy. They are not merely threatening kinetic action. They are stress-testing the West's political and economic alliances, knowing a fractured response is the desired outcome. This is why regional instability is deliberately engineered. A nation like South Africa or even Canada is not the cause of conflict. It is the proxy laboratory. These zones are used to stage and measure the effects of supply chain disruptions, energy shocks, or political destabilization on the primary target, the United States, without incurring the kinetic cost of a direct attack. The entire strategy is based on a mathematical certainty. A system compromised by debt and political paralysis, as documented in its own divisive political discourse, cannot execute a proportional response. The adversary's goal in the gray zone is to force an impossible choice: absorb the systemic damage and accelerate collapse, or trigger the final protocol, a catastrophic kinetic escalation. It is launch on warning, redefined for an era of economic warfare. The Nuclear Command Protocol is based on a doctrine from the analog era: launch on warning. If incoming ballistic missiles are detected, the system requires a retaliatory launch before initial impact. This is not a policy of aggression. It is a mathematical protocol designed to prevent an arsenal from being destroyed in its silos, guaranteeing a counterstrike. It ensures a zero-sum outcome. Arrival, however, no longer requires a kinetic launch to trigger this protocol. The modern vector is asymmetric. According to analyses from RUSI, a targeted cyber attack can blind the entire early warning apparatus, the satellites, the ground-based radar, the communication relays. This creates a systemic intelligence blackout. This is the fog of digital war. The commander is now operating blind, forced into a solvency crisis of information. Is it a system malfunction, or is it a deliberate blackout masking an incoming first strike? CSIS reports indicate there is no protocol for this ambiguity. A proportional response is impossible. You cannot proportionally respond to an enemy you cannot see or confirm. Faced with the possibility of a successful decapitation strike, the system's logic defaults to its primary function: survival. The fear of being disarmed forces the commander to assume the worst-case scenario and execute the launch protocol. The digital fragility does not create hesitation. It accelerates the kinetic cost, making catastrophic escalation the only remaining option to avoid systemic collapse. A rival power no longer tests military readiness with naval drills. They test systemic solvency. The mechanism is a calibration shot, a single deniable event engineered to measure one variable: the precise pressure required to trigger a systemic collapse. The thesis is irrefutable. Internal political fragility, the kind documented in reports from Politico, creates a liability. When a system cannot formulate a coherent response, it cannot execute a proportional one. CSIS analytics confirm this paralysis vector. Rivals such as Beijing observe this and adjust their risk calculations regarding flashpoints like Taiwan, as noted by the South China Morning Post. The 1973 oil crisis was the blueprint, proving an economic attack could fundamentally alter the American system. The modern protocol is not a slow embargo, but a digital decapitation of a critical infrastructure node. The Stimson Center's risk assessments point toward an escalation in systemic shocks. The highest probability vector is not a data center, but an energy artery. The calibration forecast. Within the next 12 months, expect a sudden, cascading failure of the industrial control systems at a primary U.S. LNG export terminal, likely in the Gulf of Mexico. It will be declared a catastrophic technical malfunction. Attribution will be impossible. The kinetic cost is zero, but the signal is absolute. A test of whether the compromised system can absorb the shock without initiating its final protocol. Total, catastrophic escalation.